Well, good morning everybody. It's now 10 o'clock, so it's time for us to reopen the hearing sessions into the examination of the submitted Crawley Borough local plan. Before we proceed with an opening statement today, can I just check, can everybody hear me okay? Yep, and hopefully you can see me as well if you need to. Good, thank you. Just to remind everybody briefly, my name is David Spencer, alongside with my colleague Mr Glenn Rollings. We are the inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 to carry out the independent examination of the submitted Crawley Borough local plan to 2040. Can I, at this early stage, ask that people will please ensure that mobile phones are switched off or on their silent settings, please. And the hearing sessions this week follow on, obviously, from part one hearing sessions in November. We're deliberately referring to the hearing sessions this week and next week as the part two hearing sessions. I wish to emphasise that there's been no formal pause in the examination proceedings. This is not a plan examination that is needed to be done in stages. I think really the part one, part two hearings have essentially reflected our availability and we appreciate the forbearance of the Council and others in accommodating this. A reminder that the Council is recording these sessions and they will be uploaded onto the examination web pages shortly afterwards. And a further reminder to the examination that we are being supported by Charlotte Glancy, who's to my left, who is the independent programme officer dealing with the administration of the examination. Just to remind everybody, Charlotte is your first point of contact if you have any queries regarding the hearings procedures or the examination more generally. You should also contact Charlotte if you wish to locate any of the documents relevant to the examination, all of which are on the examination website. Charlotte will be with us whilst these hearing sessions are sitting, or otherwise her contact details, if you do not have them, are on the examination website. And at this stage, I now turn to Charlotte to assist us with the general housekeeping rules whilst we're in this town hall building. Charlotte, please.
Morning, everyone. This is just a run through a few housekeeping matters. So there are no scheduled fire drills. So in the event of a fire alarm sounding, please leave the building via the main spiral staircase and through the main entrance doors. Once outside, please turn left and make your way to the fire assembly point located beyond the town hall multi-storey car park on Exchange Road. If you're unable to use the stairs, please wait in the chamber and you'll be guided by a member of staff to the evacuation lift. These meetings are being filmed and recorded to be later uploaded to the Council's YouTube site. You should be aware that the Council is a data controller under the Data Protection Act. Data collected during a webcast will be retained in accordance with the Council's published policy, and these specific hearings will be retained for at least 2 years. Any individual seated around the chamber and in the public gallery will be filmed by the automated camera system and your image may be captured. Therefore, by entering into the hearing room, you're consenting to being filmed and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and or training purposes. I think everybody knows how to use the mics. The toilets are just outside the doors, going through the corridor to the right, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. Now, we've identified a number of matters and issues which we wish to explore through these part two hearings. The hearing sessions which resume today will be based on these matters and issues, and will also reflect the various written statements that were submitted in mid-December, or where relevant, where we need to ratchet back to statements that were submitted in early November in response to our matters and issues. We will lead the discussions based on the agendas that we've recently released and published. On submission of the plan at the end of July 2023 and at various points subsequently, the Council has presented and maintained a schedule of proposed modifications it wishes to make to the plan. and these are presented in the document CBC CLP 07, and a reminder to the examination that the latest version is document E, which was presented by the Council on the 15th of December. It may well transpire that further modifications may be identified during these subsequent hearing sessions over the next couple of weeks. We've got a final administrative session with the Council currently scheduled for Tuesday afternoon next week, and part of that agenda for that session will be around the process around proposed main modifications. What we'll ask the Council over the next week or so is if they keep a running schedule of any further changes that the Council wishes to propose, support, or has no objection to. Do it as we go along during these Part 2 hearings. We'll also keep a record and we'll coordinate through the Programme Officer where we think that final schedule of proposed modifications potentially looks like. I think most people have already participated at these the hearing sessions back in November, so I'm not going to extensively repeat how they work, but just a gentle reminder that they are intended to be relatively structured but reasonably informal discussions. We'll be asking questions generally to the Council in the first instance, and then we'll seek to bring in others to participate as we go along. If there is a point where you wish to kind of come in on a particular part of the discussion, the convention is to upend your nameplate, and that will help signal to us that we need to bring you in on the discussion. Are there any general questions at this stage about how these hearing sessions work or operate? No. In which case, there's just a couple more things I wish to cover off as part of this brief introductory session. They're probably mainly with the Borough Council, if I turn to you to assist on this point, and probably of benefit to people more generally. The first one is in relation to obviously since we last sat, the government has published a revised national planning policy framework. Just a reminder, the starting point for the examination is that the Council has submitted in the end of July what it considered to be a sound plan consistent with national policy at that time, which was the July 2021 version of the National Planning Policy Framework. In terms of the latest framework published in December, paragraph 230 of the new NPPF is clear that plans such as Crawley's, which was obviously been submitted prior to the 19th of March 2024, will continue to be examined against the 2021 National Planning Policy Framework. I will now extend or just double check with the Council that it's content to proceed on that basis, whether there's anything that leads us to a conclusion that we should be looking at various parts of the new NPPF for the soundness of this plan. Is it Ms Brigden who's going to assist on this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Council concur with the approach to continue under the July 2021 NPPF. Thank you.
Thank you. I was anticipating that, but I just thought I'd just check, just in case, because some authorities may be looking at things differently in light of the new NPPF. So I think with that in mind, I think obviously all references in existing statements to paragraphs in the 2021 NPPF remain valid. References to the NPPF in these hearings we'll anticipate will be to the 2021 version, and similarly our report when it's issued will be referencing the 2021 NPPF. Thank you. In terms of the other thing I just wanted to again just deal with now before we get into the substance of today's hearing sessions is latest evidence. A number of documents have been submitted into the examination since the November hearings, primarily by the Borough Council. Most of those documents we see are what we would describe as existing published documents that have been referred to either by the Council or by others in their statements, and I think our general view is that it's probably right that the examination library has the latest or the correct or appropriate version of those documents, that we're not potentially following erroneous hyperlinks to documents that may not be the right version. But there are nonetheless a small number of new evidence documents. They're helpfully identified. Hopefully people have seen them on the examination website as part of the examination updates. I think it would just be helpful if I can just briefly highlight them now and just make sure with the council we're not missing anything. There's nothing that's kind of potentially kind of slipping through the net. So if I lead on this, and I'll just double check with the council on this. So in terms of the infrastructure delivery schedule, we now have an updated version. I think it's IP08 of December 2023. Obviously we'll start looking at that, I think, on Thursday this week and into Tuesday next week. So just check with the council that still remains the latest version. I'll call it the IDS for shorthand. We're not missing a further update. Is that correct? Thank you. And is it primarily that update that's then subsequently informed updates to statements of common ground with National Highways and West Sussex County Council? Yep. Thank you for that. And then we also have an update, an appendix to topic paper 7. I think that's the development and noise technical appendix. I think again we'll probably touch on that primarily tomorrow as part of the environmental policies environmental policies session. So just want to note we've got that. There's nothing further we should be anticipating. We then have a further explanatory note from the Council on proposed modifications to policy EC5. This is the employment and skills, and it's our intention that we'll deal with that next Tuesday. I think it's sort of made sense to us to kind of build that into wider discussions when we certainly come on to sort of plan viability, to address it at that session. And I note it's now been picked up in the statement of common ground with Gatwick Green Limited that we received yesterday. We've then got I think it's the appendix, which is provided by Nexus. It's the retail town centre update. I'll call it retail town centre update. It's primarily around justifying the retail impact threshold. Again, we'll pick that up in tomorrow morning's session. I think hopefully the council's aware that we've given Quad, who are representing DT, last mile retail, I've given them the opportunity to kind of provide further submissions on that as they're unable to attend tomorrow. We think that's the only further evidence we've got in relation to town centre and retail. Yeah. And then coming back to today's hearing session, we've got an updated housing trajectory of December 2023. We've also got a site allocations and flood risk background paper, which kind of has a crossover in terms of site capacity, and I guess linked to that is the final update to the strategic flood risk assessment, again, which will kind of lap over into tomorrow's sessions as well. I think in terms of the housing trajectory, we'll come on to this, but my understanding is to reflect primarily the amended plan period, and then there are obviously other factual kind of updates that we kind of perhaps need to touch upon. Yep. Then linked to the housing trajectory, we've got the updated employment land trajectory and land availability, employment land availability assessment. I think again, is this primarily around the updated plan period? Yeah. Yep. Thank you. And then for Thursday this week, we've got the updated modifications to policy GAT2, DD5, which we'll come on to when we revisit Gatwick on Thursday morning. And then just my apologies to the council for confusion around this. The Gatwick car parking survey, which is now GA26, I was getting slightly paranoid about Gatwick Airport, but I understand now it's more in relation to the discussion we'll have around policy GAT3. Yep. So thank you for that. And then finally, in terms of evidence, we've got the updated modifications to policy SD4 on water neutrality and the issue about whether the timing of a plan review. I think, again, we've programmed that in for Tuesday next week. We'll pick that up. I think that's a canter through, but I think that summarises from our perspective where we think the additional evidence is. Is there anything further from the Borough Council that we've either missed or is potentially... We're not inviting any further information or evidence, but is there...
It was just the updates to the statements of common ground. There were three updated statements of common ground. You mentioned the Gatwick Green Limited one. There's also the update to the National Highways and then update to the West Sussex County Council. And as you correctly suggested, they were based on the updated version of the IDS.
Thank you for those. I think from what we'll say at this point moving forward is, I think from both Mr. Rollings and mine's perspective, is that we'll be strongly resisting any sort of further evidence unless it's something that we request or it's something that becomes clear from discussions at these hearings that would be helpful to the examination in terms of a clarificatory note. I think we're strongly cautioning against any further evidence now. It could potentially result in further delays, issues around procedural fairness. We are in sort of the final part of the hearings now. We've got over 30 pages of examination library, so we've got a lot of evidence before us. I think we want to sort of say it's going to be on a pretty exceptional basis now that we want to see any further new evidence provided to us. Before we move on to this morning's main business, is there anything else from the Borough Council in terms of administration or these examination hearings that we need to deal with up front? No? Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, so we now move on in terms of this morning's business for these hearings examinations, and hopefully everybody is here for the start of discussions on matter 6, which is generally dealing with housing policies. We're going to be taking this morning's agenda in various parts. We are going to deal with issue 3 first, which is the approach to Gypsy and Traveller and Travelling Showpeople provision. I appreciate there's nobody here, possibly other than Homes England, who may wish to contribute on this point. Mr. Pete is shaking his head. You're probably here for other items. So it's going to, I'm afraid, probably be myself and the council on this point. We'll then come on to the council's approach to housing supply and housing delivery. We're going to be looking at some of the specific sites that remain within policy H2, as probably we'd describe them as genuine allocations for this plan. And then this afternoon we'll carry on with sites including the Tinsley Lane site, and then come on to look at more general development management policies in relation to housing, including the affordable housing policy and other policies on housing mix. In terms of participation at this session, can I turn first to the council to understand who's going to be helping us on matter 6 today, please?
Hello, yes, I'm Sally LePage, the Strategic Planning Manager. On my left, Elizabeth Brigden, our Planning Policy Manager, who'll be leading most of this morning's session. To her left, David Monk, Environmental Health Noise Consultant, to help you on those questions. And then Ian Warren will pick up on the more detailed housing points later on. Thank you.
Thank you. As indicated, the first session is, first item we'll be looking at Gypsy and Traveller provision. I appreciate other people are not necessarily here for that, so I'm afraid you're going to have to wait probably till we've got to mid-morning adjournment before we get on to other items. But for the benefit of the recording of these sessions, can I now turn to other people who are likely to speak and participate today, and can I start with Mr. Pete to introduce, just very briefly introduce yourself and who you're representing today, please.
Yes, hi. Aaron Pete from WSP. I'm a planning director. I'm representing Homes England this morning and this afternoon. I am primarily here to
Thank you. If I turn over to my the left side of the room, can I start with the gentleman at the back, please?
Hello, my name's Tony Fullwood, Tony Fullwood Associates, representing the Bucknell family in relation to the allocation, housing, biodiversity and heritage site land east of Balcombe Road. I'll be speaking on that matter for them. Thank you.
Yes, Mark Hendy, Senior Planning Manager for Persimmon Homes. I'm here in relation to Matter 6, Issues 1 and 4, specifically in relation to the Forge Wood Phase 4B site.
Okay.
Hello, my name's Laura Brooke. I'm from the Sussex Wildlife Trust and I'm a Conservation Officer, and I'm here in relation to Matter 6.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to start with the Gypsy and Traveller issue first and the policy framework there. And in terms of the approach to this issue, as the Council probably seen from the agenda, wants to look at the assessment of need first. We'll then look at the approach to identifying the reserve site at Broadfield Kennels. And then we'll look at the soundness of policy H8 in terms of, I'll describe them broadly as windfall proposals, were they to sort of come forward and arise within Crawley. So in terms of the first issue around assessment of need, obviously the examination now benefits from an updated Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Assessment document HHN06, and we asked a number of supplementary questions on this back in November. And I think where we want to sort of start the discussion in terms of the outcomes of that process is whether I think it probably follows on from MI or supplementary question 6.33, is whether the evidence base is justified in sort of saying there is no conclusive need, I think certainly to provide a publicly owned site within the short term, and whether that's as we say, a justified approach for the borough, given there are clearly, from reading the GTAA and other representations, appear to be sites, pitches within the borough. Appreciate where they are relative to Gatwick Airport and the safeguarding area, but in terms of the general approach and conclusions of the updated Gypsy Traveller Assessment, in terms of that overall conclusion that there's kind of just no short-term need, certainly for a publicly owned site. Is it Ms. Brigden first, please?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, as you mentioned, we have maintained a Gypsy and Traveller and Travelling Showpeople accommodation needs assessment throughout the whole of the preparation of the local plan. The key updates that we've undertaken since the adopted plan include the census data, encampment data, housing and homelessness register information, and throughout the local plan review public consultations. We have we did submit a version of the plan of the accommodation needs assessment with the local plan, and as you mentioned, we did update it finally for a final version in November. And the main reasons for that were because we were still undertaking some surveys, interviews with the traveller community, and we wanted to maintain that opportunity for as long as possible to get the most accurate information and reflection that we could for the examination. We do conclude that even through the interviews that we undertook, there is no need for a publicly owned site. There have been no requests. We had the Broadfield Kennel site has been allocated since 2015. And since that time, there have been no requests at all for pitches on a public site coming forward. What we have had is a need for family pitches, which are privately owned, and that has mainly arisen from travellers coming from outside of the borough and finding sites within Crawley that they can use for their traveller sort of residential traveller, permanent traveller needs. From that, we have 2 sites which are currently being considered through the planning system. One is for a further temporary permission. It's already been subject to two temporary permissions. The need for these sites to be temporary lies in the fact that they're located within the area that's safeguarded for Gatwick Airport. So the temporary permission essentially simply reflects the fact that it couldn't be a permanent site because of the potential for further runway expansion at Gatwick. The other one is currently being considered through an appeal. It was actually granted a temporary permission through appeal, but that was quashed on a legality. However, on that one, the noise situation particularly has been reassessed, and the council no longer maintains the noise objection to that particular site. So actually, from some on some level, that site has improved its potential, but obviously it's still subject to appeal. On that basis, the assessment concludes that there isn't a need for a publicly owned site at this moment in time. However, should either or neither of those sites secure temporary permission, it does acknowledge that actually there is a need for family-sized pitch sites. Through the interviews discussed, the traveller families were very clear that they didn't want to return to a large publicly owned site. They'd had very negative experiences on the ones that they had left previously. That doesn't necessarily mean that the opportunities within Crawley are not suitable for them. But what it means would be that there are the alternatives of other smaller sites within the borough and or bringing forward the Broadfield Kennel site in a slightly different approach. So as it currently stands, the needs assessment concludes that there still is no need immediately arising, but it acknowledges that there could well be, depending on the outcome of the appeals and the planning application decisions.
Thank you. So that's helpful clarification. So if the subject to the outcomes of the current sort of planning processes, then potentially the Broadfield site could form an option for accommodation. I mean, presumably, I know what you say, Ms. Brigden, in terms of the preference or from these existing traveller households for sort of private, small-scale private sort of sites. But as we get increasingly familiar with the borough, trying to think where those could be, presumably we are coming back consistently to the safeguarded area as the only kind of...
Yeah, there is obviously the very small sort of strips between the built-up area boundary and the safeguarded area, which could potentially be found. But we also acknowledge in the plan that any site essentially that's suitable for residential could also potentially be suitable for traveller family, depending on the access and the detailed site. So from that perspective, it would be very much a nuanced site-by-site consideration, which is very different to what we obviously have done through the local plan, where we, take a much wider look at providing a larger pitch site.
Okay. And in terms of Crawley, it seems from the evidence that the particular issue for the borough, I mean, it's an issue that applies for other local authorities, is existing Gypsy households that would identify their ethnicity as Gypsy or traveller, but are currently living within bricks and mortar accommodation. This seems to be a particular issue for Crawley, given the very nature of the borough and the kind of the existing character, etc. I mean, the way I read the GTAA is it seemed to be describing as kind of been a sort of a light touch approach to try and sort of understand whether there are needs arising from within bricks and mortar, and whether that's newly forming households, younger people who say, well, we may have grown up in this, but culturally we come from a Gypsy traveller background, so we want culturally appropriate accommodation. We don't necessarily want to carry on living in bricks and mortar. Or households who may at this moment tolerate bricks and mortar but have an aversion to that type of accommodation. I just wonder whether the council's approach, whether you've really kind of got to the bottom or unpicked whether there is a kind of a need, whether you have your own Gypsy liaison officers within the borough, or whether that's something I've come across where that's perhaps a role that the county council still retains. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, we were extremely lucky previously with the adopted plan when we were doing the assessment back in 2012 to 2014. We had a liaison officer in the council who had worked for a long time with the travelling community and was able to provide us with a connection to a fair number, actually, a fair proportion of those traveller families. And obviously you'll see in the GTTA we've retained that information. It is valuable. It might be 10 years dated now, but actually it provided us with a really good understanding of the types of traveller families and the individuals and what they potentially might aspire to have in the future. It hasn't arisen. We on the basis of the 2014 study, we did bring forward the Broadfield Kennel site for up to 10 pitches, as we applied a growth calculation which made an assumption that out of some of those households there could well be some new forming households and or travellers and or individuals who wanted to take up the life, the more, like, as you suggest, the more culturally appropriate accommodation. That hasn't materialised from our bricks and mortar families. However, when we came to reviewing this study, we were simply unable to engage with those travelling families. There's a number of issues. The main one is that the council no longer holds the role as with a liaison officer within the borough council. There is a county council liaison travelling officer. However, they do not have any contacts within travellers within Crawley because of the nature of them being from bricks and mortar accommodation and also the small privately owned sites, so that we don't have the public sites within Crawley that the county council liaison officer otherwise comes into more frequent contact with. We also tried to reach out to the traveller families liaison group, and we were unable to receive any support or contact from them to try and understand whether or not they knew of any of the community or families within Crawley. And then on top of that, we have the Data Protection Act, which has restricted what we've been able to find out. None of the families within Crawley Homes have identified as Gypsy Traveller. So we struggled to be able to speak to any of the bricks and mortar traveller families at this stage for this plan. But we still felt that actually the conversations we'd had back in 2012 to 2014 were still valid, and on that basis we've retained the assumption that there could still be within the plan period travelling families who wished to move to a caravan accommodation, and on that basis, whilst we think that it was an overestimation, we had 10 pitches for 15 years, and we're now in 10 years of that, and that hasn't materialised. But we have retained the 10 pitches at the Broadfield Kennel site as a reserve option, both for meeting potential needs from the private pitch site families, as well as any growth that does come out from the bricks and mortar travelling community.
Thank you for that. And in terms of identifying potential need, I mean, obviously the planning policy for traveller sites has recently been updated, so we've gone back, in my mind, we've gone back to the previous definition following the Court of Appeal judgment in the case of Lisa Smith, to now go back to including those who have permanently ceased to travel for various reasons. I mean, I'm assuming from what you're saying there, Ms Brigden, is the council has, in its view, taken a suitably kind of precautionary approach, irrespective of the new definite or the reversion of the definition, to provide this kind of reserve site for up to 10 pitches.
Yeah, absolutely. The 2014 study was done on the previous MPPF definition, which included those travellers who had ceased to travel permanently. We continued that approach regardless, because of the nature of the travellers and the travelling families within Crawley. We've never specifically identified whether or not the travelling families are travelling. It's more whether or not they've actually wanted to live on a pitch site and have caravan accommodation as opposed to any accommodation, and whether bricks and mortar housing is appropriate. And you will have seen in the needs assessment, we also identify that actually there is a role to play for looking at how bricks and mortar accommodation could potentially be appropriate, culturally appropriate for travelling families, whether they've ceased permanently to travel or whether they're continuing to travel, and it would only be those travelling families who actually do desire to have a caravan lifestyle, whether that's to travel or otherwise. And the definition in our needs assessment reflects the current MPPF version, which has obviously, as you say, been reversed due to the legal decision.
Thank you. We'll come on shortly to the Broadfield kennel site, which we obviously understand is carried forward from the previous local plan. I mean, if we were to arrive at a conclusion that there was a need potentially sooner rather than later, is that a site that could flex or respond in shorter than the last sort of 10 years of the plan period?
The site has its challenges. It's in terms of the access, particularly. It would take additional funding for the council to be able to bring that forward. However, the site has been assessed. It is a suitable site, and it's within the council's ownership, it's within the council's gift. It's currently not used for any existing purpose. The council does have some concerns about antisocial behaviour and the like with that site, so there would be benefits to bringing that site forward to a productive use, and so it does have that. It certainly wouldn't be a site that could come forward in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years, but it could come forward sooner if it was needed. And certainly the council has undertaken some initial preliminary studies in relation to how that could come forward.
Thank you. Is there anything further the council wishes to say in relation to kind of the need, or the need that has not been the need that has not been identified in the short term, or has not been for publicly owned site? I mean, it seems to be you're taking a precautionary approach in terms of identifying a medium to long term site should things change.
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly the case of the council. Isn't a current need, but we wouldn't want, because the borough is so constrained, and the demands on the land is so great. We think that the site is appropriate to retain its allocation.
Thank you. So just moving on then briefly to the Broadfield Kennels site, as mentioned, obviously it's a site that was found sound as part of the previous local plan process, so perhaps understandably it's carried forward as part of this plan examination. I mean, has anything, I mean, you just highlighted there, Ms Brigden, some of the issues relating to those sites, the site, and it's been raised in some of the Reg 19 representations about whether it's genuinely can be delivered, particularly in relation to highway access. Has the council kind of reassured itself in terms of preparing this plan that remains a developable site in terms of obviously the criteria that are set out in the planning policy for traveller sites, or have you looked or appraised, are there any other potential site options that would outperform the Broadfield Kennels site?
Yeah, as set out in the Gypsy Travelling Showpeople Accommodation Needs Assessment, the council's undertaken some substantial studies into site assessments around the borough over the last sort of 20 years, actually, dating back to 2004. And the Broadfield Kennel site at the last examination was quite clearly shown to be well, and I think the inspector concluded it is the only option that we have that would be a suitable site. So from that perspective, yes, when we commenced the local plan review, we continued to retain that as the main reserve traveller site. What we have done is looked a little bit more in terms of that site. We did the sustainability appraisal, did relook at all the other options, and particularly the 2 sites that were considered in the 2015 plan, which was the Langley Green site against the Broadfield Kennel site. And again, the conclusions were retained from that position. There really aren't the other options for something of that size. As I say, there might be something that's particularly more suitable for single family, privately owned site within the borough, but from the perspective of a public site that we feel as a council, we have that certainty that it's within the control of the council to bring forward when it's needed. The Broadfield Kennel site offers that. It has public access through footpath underneath the road, through directly into Broadfield neighbourhood, so it has access to the town and the neighbourhood facilities, and aside from the issues of detailed design, layout and construction, we still feel that it's a developable site, yes.
And in terms of the highways position, I mean, we've seen the access, or the existing current sort of access from the A264. I mean, I'm trying to recall, I don't think this is a plan where, say, where West Sussex County Council, as the Highway Authority, comment or object to things on highway grounds. But in terms of this site allocation and potentially what may be required in terms of safely accessing this site, I think the council's statement, I think, recognises that improvements will be needed. There's potentially a significant cost around that, which may require further or exploring grant funding to try and unlock that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we have undertaken some preliminary assessments of what access would be appropriate, and we've done that in discussion with the County Council. They are comfortable that there's nothing that would suggest that it couldn't be brought forward safely, and yes, it is simply a matter of needing to go further into the detailed design and securing funding. It would be costly to access the site, and that is something that the council's acknowledged even prior with the initial allocation. So it's not a surprise to the council.
There's no in principle objection that the access could be secured from the A264, subject to necessary improvements.
Yeah, no, quite the reverse. The County Council have accepted that it would be possible to secure a safe access and exit from that site onto the A264.
Thank you. And just a final question for me on the Broadfield Kennel site. Just to clarify in my own mind, as a matter of fact, this site is within what was the AONB, now the new national landscape, but there's no objection or kind of concern of the principle, because it was found sound relatively recently. So
yes, yeah, absolutely. There's no objection from the High Weald National Landscapes AONB unit on that basis, and yes, I think we've written into the policy that acknowledgement that that the site would need to be carefully designed, laid out according to it, because of that, reflecting its location. However, at the previous local plan examination, it was also acknowledged that caravans are single storey, and actually the tree cover around that area is quite dense. There would need to be some removal of some of the landscaping for the access, but obviously that would be part of a planning application, detailed landscape design.
thank you for that. I've got no further questions on the Broadfield Kennels site. I just say it's in the existing plan, and it's obviously to that extent carried forward. And I'll report will look at obviously the various the small number of representations that have kind of queried its deliverability until such a time as the Broadfield Kennels site comes forward, or the need materialises for it to come forward. Obviously policy, the last part of policy H8 provides the development management framework, as I think I described them earlier, for kind of windfall proposals, and the council's referred to, well, certainly from reading the evidence, there's kind of the two sites or proposals I was perhaps aware of concurrently in the kind of the planning system. We've also asked various questions about the soundness of the criteria that the council's looking to apply. I think, am I correct in when I've looked back at the 2015 local plan, this was a different policy, I think it was policy H5, that it's effectively the same criteria. There's no...
Yeah, the criteria is identical, yeah.
Okay. And in terms of kind of looking again, presumably as part of the plan, preparation process and whether those kind of, the policy remains kind of up to date. I think the one area I probably want to sort of explore first, and this may be where Mr. Monk can assist the examinations on criteria A. I think that's referred to, I think it struck me that a number of kind of windfall proposals will inevitably occur within the safeguarding area for Gatwick due to the very nature of the borough, but I accept there may be, you know, other alternative locations or sites within the urban fabric elsewhere. But I just want to understand particularly the interrelationship between criterion A, and we'll come on to how it fits with policy GAP 2 on kind of safeguarding, about how this will all work in terms of when we're looking at kind of individual proposals, or as the council's referred to, the kind of renewal of pitches in this location due to or renewal subject to temporary permissions. If we deal with the noise issue first, I think it's whether criterion A remains justified since policy H5, and I think it's understanding this 57 decibel threshold for permanent sites, and then distinguishing, or this then subsequent distinction for further long-term temporary, whatever that means. I know the council will explain the definition, and then for the 66 decibel for the shorter term transit site provision. So I can ask the council to kind of explain the kind of why that approach should continue to kind of be found sound, whether there's anything that has been illuminated from the recent exploration of these issues at the coalface of the planning appeals that may indicate whether there's a need to kind of tweak any of this, or whether it remains a kind of a robust and kind of proportionate approach. Is it Mr. Monk who'll come in on this first?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, David Monk. So basically the criterion sets out for, we mentioned the permanent transit site, so that's something that we understand to be in place in perpetuity, so people will have the greatest exposure to noise. Generally speaking, the effects of noise will be such that there could be annoyance, it can result in cognitive learning issues. During daytime we can see direct health effects upon individuals, and importantly during night time, which is becoming increasingly important with awakenings, we can see further health effects. So the daytime effects are normally associated with hypertension, potential incidence of strokes. There is new information emerging linking noise exposure with diabetes and changes to microbiome gut bacteria, so which is having further effects on brain health. In the night time, we're particularly looking at awakening events. That's the most critical part, and there's increasing research at the moment, particularly with some more recent things that are coming as a result of the House of Lords Select Committee. There are two new pieces of research that are being undertaken by Professor Charlotte Clark, who we've also relied on her evidence in the 2015 paper, and she's also been involved in UK national work previously. The effect of the awakenings is to basically accelerate brain degeneration and cause hypertension, and is particularly essential in the pathway for strokes. So we are having regard to these human exposure to the sound levels in these locations and how that might be mitigated. Problem with sound, by the way, if I might just say, you've probably come across this before, I'm sure, but when you have a 10 decibel increase in sound level, it's a doubling in loudness due to the logarithmic scale that's being used. So if you've got something that's at 50 decibels, it goes to 60 decibels, that's actually a very large increase. It's a doubling. And if it then goes from the 60 to the 70, that's in essence a quadrupling from the 50 decibel. Generally speaking, a 10 decibel increase, you'll see an increase in relative risk of around 10%. So in a population where you might have, for argument's sake, 2,500 incidents of stroke, then you can expect to see that to increase by another 250 on that 10 decibel increase from the 50. Okay, so let's just pause that there. What we have, we've looked at the contours associated with a potential Gatwick exposure. We have safeguarding for the wide space southern runway. There is also another development consent order there's a development consent order in progress at the moment, which we also have noise contours for projected through to 2047. And these have particular effects across the whole of the site. The whole of Crawley. The wide space southern runway isn't yet, it's not the preferred option by central government at the moment, but yet they're still requiring the land to be safeguarded, as you've probably come across. So it's still something that's there. It's still a consideration. And it could come into play if the third runway at Heathrow, if there are issues with that. So on top of that, we had some further work, which I think was 2018, with the aviation policy, which basically said you can make better use of the runway, which has led to the northern runway proposal. All of these have significant noise impacts across the area. Now, the 57, the contour that we were looking at there is basically related to, it has a combination of effects. It looks at both daytime noise exposure, and it is also coincident with a nighttime noise incident exposure as well. So at that threshold at the moment, and I have to caveat this, that the research since since 2009, with the World Health Organization guidelines, we've had additional guidelines in 2018 from the World Health Organization. They've again been reviewed by Brink and others in 2022 to say that the exposure responses to those noise levels are in fact higher than were estimated under the environmental noise guidelines in 2018. In addition to this, there's increasing concern over awakenings and night noise and the average amount of sleep that people can achieve. So in balancing everything, the 57-day contour, which I think is coincident with the 54-night contour, gives us an exposure in the area that you might experience if you're out and about, but it also gives us an idea about what's happening at night as well and what needs to be achieved during the night period to protect people. Now, these are chronic effects, they're long-term effects, which is why we've set the threshold at a lower level than we did for the other shorter-term exposures. I have looked at, there's some comments about appeals that have been made, and I have had regard to those reports. I have some notes on them, and if I might just say, the structure that you have with the caravan is inherently less good at reducing sound exposure than you had in a conventional brick-built structure. By my own calculation, and this is in accordance with a very old formula, it's nothing peculiar that I've manufactured. If you have a 1.6mm steel skin, that will give you something like a 13 decibel reduction. If you've got a brick wall, that will give you 48 decibel reduction. Its size has been close to 50, but my calculation says 48, so I'll go with that because that's conservative. The 13 to 48 difference, because of this doubling, means there's something like a 10 to 12-fold decrease in noise exposure within the building. So that's the magnitude of effect that that we're considering here. Now, there are some, there's certainly some British standards been referred to in caravan construction, and claims made as what can be achieved. That is in an experimental setting where everything, individual panels are constructed, mounted, tested under laboratory conditions. There is none of the workmanship issues that might arise, none of the quality issues that might arise with installation and transportation and other defects that can subsequently arise. Within a caravan, you have to have some form of fixed ventilation to allow to prevent exposure to combustion gases if you've got combustion appliances. And generally speaking, you're going to need ventilation anyway, but some of the other sort of sanitary areas. That will afford almost no benefit in reducing the sound levels that people are exposed to. To give you an idea, when I was at college, we did a calculation looking at a wall with a door, and there was a keyhole. And basically the size of the keyhole in a wall that was basically the size of the wall behind you had the effect of negating most of the sound insulation capacity of that wall. So if you've got a vent which has to be there to prevent carbon monoxide and everything else that goes with it, you will have this exposure to sound if it's in the external environment. I have looked at some of the reports that were cited. I've got a couple of comments on those that, first of all, when you...
Sorry, so Mr. Monk, is this in relation, because I think it was Homes England who
Yes.
provided, I think as part of their statement, a number of examples of other decisions and cases. Yep. So this is your response to picking up some themes from that.
Yes,
Yep.
I think it's worthwhile taking a look at those and just bearing that in mind. First of all, I don't know. I've seen it's very common to quote the British standard BS 8233, which refers to a steady state noise. So if you've got a fan unit or a road in the distance, what it doesn't cater for is when you have got large individual events, such as with an aircraft overflight. So you cannot apply the same standard. You cannot apply that BS 8233. It does not. It's not equivalent to it. So the difference between, sorry, just refer to my notes if I may, for those specific ones. I noted in some of them that there wasn't a windows open scenario was noted in some of those appeals. So whilst it was useful to see what the sound reduction was, and I think it was in the order of between 20 and 25 decibels, although it's slightly higher in some of the new ones, even then the internal sound levels overnight would still be on. Awakenings will start at a threshold of 33 decibels, and that's a maximum noise level event. And the higher the sound level that you have, the fewer of those events that you need to have an awakening. And there was a range of between 41 and I think 51 in some of the poorer construction events were noted overnight. You need very few of these to actually cause an awakening. And how important is a single awakening? It's not necessarily something you'd be conscious of. It could be a move from a different sleep phase to a higher sleep phase, but because your hearing is a sentry sense, it's on the lookout for any potential threats, and it's sitting there working in the background. At the moment with aircraft noise, it's emerging that one additional awakening for a person per night is a significant observed adverse effect level. That's where it's heading. That's something Heathrow are looking at with their noise contours and their considerations, and I'm sure that will feature locally in other areas. So we can see from the nighttime perspective for those units that some of those areas I think certainly will be exposed to levels that will cause those awakenings, and that's because the nature of the structure, not because they're any different to anybody else. It's the structure. Some comments have also been made about the period of activity, and it's really important to understand that for Gatwick, it's got incredible seasonality. The summer period is probably influences the rest of the year in noise terms. Excuse me. Compared to Heathrow, for example, during the 92-day summer period, Gatwick has 3.5 times the amount of night flights that Heathrow has. So when you take these factors, so that's the night period. The day period, you will see typically the summer season, the 6-month summer season, is much busier than the winter period. But also during the day, you will have peak times with the nature of the operations at the airport, particularly with the likes of, I won't go into any specific carriers, but with the nature of the fleet that's at Gatwick, you'll find that they need to start early and finish late to optimise the turnarounds. And this is slightly different to the fleet that operates at Heathrow, which tends to be bigger and flying to different locations which are further afield. So you tend to find that during that night period, that there is quite an intensity of flights, and this is a particular issue locally. And that is on top of the increase in the number of movements, and which I think I looked for I think the last reliable figures were 2018, and it was something like 800 aircraft movements a day is the kind of exposure that we're dealing with. So all in all, if you go to a site on a particular day, at a particular time, you are unlikely to really experience what it's like there to be, because most of these figures are looking at over 3 months, 6 months or 12 months. So it's going to be very difficult to understand that going down on one particular day. Even you might be unfortunate in the morning, or fortunate depending upon which way you're looking at it, and it might be one every minute that you're seeing an overflight. Or you could be mid-afternoon, say for example on a Saturday, where you've maybe got almost no traffic, at least 4 years ago, pre-COVID. So in terms of using the noise thresholds, we obviously have the noise contours, and what does that mean? And what does that mean if it cuts across the site? If you're saying, we've got a 57 here, is it a sharp cut-off? Well, it's not at all. What happens is, basically, if you take the annoyance, for example, you find that a percentage of people above that will be affected by the noise, such that they are annoyed by it. And there will be people who aren't affected by it equally, but we're looking at an average population. But then below that, there will also be a percentage of the population, maybe not quite as high, but they are still being affected. So you have to be quite careful in interpreting where a line might go across a field. It's not a hard physical characteristic like a river, for example, or a stream. So there will be a gradation of effect across a particular site. So in that regard, in looking at the sites and trying to bring this all together, with these contours that we proposed, we do think that they are appropriate when you take all these things into consideration, even having regard to the other decisions that have been made. Yeah, I think that's fair to stop there.
No, that's very comprehensive. I'm also mindful we're going to be looking at policy EP4 on environmental protection on policy tomorrow as well. But I think just bringing this back to kind of Gypsy and Travellers, it's very helpful to kind of hear a bit more about kind of the effectiveness or otherwise of kind of the construction of caravans versus bricks and mortar. I mean, if we were to find the kind of gradated approach within criterion A of the policy sound, in terms of its implication, what that means in the real world on the ground. I assume that we're taking the 57 decibel contour, and I take the point, Mr. Monk, about not getting sort of too fixated on the precise kind of delineation of that contour, but taking it as the kind of the broad starting point for the application of policy. Is that I'm assuming that's the 57 decibel as shown in the noise annex to the plan, taken from the assumption around the 2040 daytime flights for Gatwick, assuming a second runway.
It is. Yes, it is.
Yeah. So in the interim period, what does this mean on a day-to-day level for anybody coming forward with a Gypsy and Traveller pitch proposal? Because, as I say, it seems to me there's going to be a focus on what is it currently the existing safeguarding area as primarily the largest kind of undeveloped or open area within the borough. Is all of that within the 57 decibel kind of contour? Does it kind of, I mean, is it in effect, does this in a practical sense, does this policy effectively prohibit any form of Gypsy and Traveller provision north of Manor Royal?
I don't believe it prohibits, because there's the exposure that we've looked at is that's the chronic exposure. Understanding that noise, there's a dose response relationship with this. So if you reduce the dose and there's a suitable recovery period, then you can allow something in that, and that's what the policy's tried to build.
And in terms of how this kind of overlaps, as mentioning earlier, obviously this is a safeguarded area, so it's not perhaps slight deviation from noise, but just more generally, this is an area where, presumably subject to, we've got policy gap 2 as well, things can only be allowed or permitted on effectively a temporary basis, in terms of, even though they're described as permanent sites for the purpose of this policy. I think Ms Lepage is nodding her head. The practical element of that is they're going to be a temporary consent.
Yes, and I think as we've set out in our response on MIQ 527, we've sought to agree the wording regarding temporary uses with Gatwick. Previously, they raised concerns about developers exploiting the wording in our adopted local plan policy about temporary uses. So we had taken it out in the early rounds of our Reg 19 consultations. But more recently, in response to the further publication consultation, Gatwick have accepted temporary uses can be appropriate in the safeguarded area. So we've therefore reinstated wording from the adopted local plan with some further clarification in paragraph 1019. That was set out already in our response in the MIQs for the November hearings, but it's also now fully set out in the new mod schedule and in the note on DD5 and GAP2 that we submitted. So that's EGSM GA21, and that comes with it the letter from Gatwick that confirm that they're happy with the wording between us.
Thank you for that. And then in terms of the sort of the policy then dealing with other proposals, I was curious about this. We then come to sort of the 60 decibel threshold for long-term temporary. I was kind of trying to get my head round, from a practical point of view, the difference between a long-term temporary and something that might be acceptable at the 57 decibel, because it's going to be temporary anyway by virtue of being within GAT2. But I think the council's proposing some modifications, I think, to just clarify what long-term, and long-term might not be as long as we might think.
Yeah, the issue actually of this, because this wording is in the adopted plan, and actually we have found some difficulties, particularly in the appeal, the most recent appeal. This wording particularly tripped up and led to the quashing. So that's why we have tried to clarify it through the modifications. Absolutely happy for some fresh eyes on how close we've got. Essentially, so the 57 decibels is for a permanent residential site where the family live there, stay there, and, you know, so it's completely separate to a temporary planning permission, which they would be granted to live there permanently. The 60 decibels for the long-term temporary transit sites, essentially that is what you would normally imagine a transit site. So the families could be there for a day or two, but they could equally be there for a week or a month. Your normal transit period. Whereas the 66 relates to temporary transit sites where people might only have one night overnight stay, so it's much shorter term, and that's what we're trying to sort of explain, and David will be able to sort of give the technical reasons why those three particular sort of time periods are considered to be relevant to the different decibels, but yes, it's the confusion between the temporary the temporary use of the site compared to the temporary permission. So yes, that's why we've suggested the modifications. Yeah. So the middle one, the 60 decibels is what you would normally assume your transit use of a site would be, so longer than a single night. But the pitches, the sites could be used permanently for those purposes, but just not by the same individuals. Hopefully that's clear. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just reminding myself of the precise wording that's proposed in the latest 7E schedule. So I've got those there in terms of I think there's the distinction that the council is trying to seek, and in terms of again coming back to the noise issue, Mr. Monk, in terms of heard a bit about the 57, but then these further distinctions around 60 decibels for the long-term temporary up to a month, and then 66 decibels being potentially appropriate for very short-term overnight, almost emergency style sort of transit accommodation.
Yes, so most of the information we have, it relates to the long-term chronic health effects. There was some work just recently with, it was around Heathrow Airport, and again it was Professor Clark, showing that there was an increased incidence of hospital admissions associated with stroke, and that was on the basis of something that occurred overnight, but that will have been an additional burden on, or additional exposure on those individuals based on an ongoing exposure. So what we're trying to do here is simply differentiate and allow what we think is a reasonable period for people to be exposed to that without having any either acute or chronic health impacts.
Thank you. And is the council able to advise me on a practical level, have you ever had to, since, I mean, let's say this comes forward from the previous local plan, have you ever had to kind of deal with this issue, particularly on the 66 decibel for a very short stay transit site? But I think you've mentioned, Ms. Brigden, it has cropped up in relation to, I'll call it the middle tier of what do we mean by long-term temporary?
Yes, it's more been in terms of that confusion between the temporary planning permission and the temporary, whether 60 decibels acceptable for a temporary permission for permanent site to permanent use in that period, rather than the shorter term for the 66.
So I'm mindful of what the council said earlier. Seems that there's an ongoing appeal process. I'm cautious not to tread too much over what may be happening there. But in terms of that site, was it the Radford Road site? From my reading of the council's evidence, that was a decision you obviously sought to be quashed on a technical basis. And without getting too much into the nitty-gritty, and just trying to, I think from my own perspective, be assured that whatever policy goes forward, perhaps it doesn't open things up to potentially a similar issue. Was it a case of misinterpreting that 60 decibels is potentially appropriate for a scheme you'd ordinarily want to see within the 57? I think you're just nodding to that.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Or explanation.
No, that's exactly the issue. The issue. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I note the council has put forward a number of proposed modifications in relation to policy H8. I think some of the supporting text, I think, seek to clarify that issue, which we'll reflect on further, having heard what we've considered this morning. In relation to criterion A of policy H8, is there anything further that the council wishes to say in terms of the implementation of that particular part of the policy? No. Okay, I will just very briefly cover off the rest of policy H8, and then we'll probably have a mid-morning adjournment, and then others who are patiently waiting will know that they'll come on to other housing matters. Obviously, there are other criterion within the policy, and obviously we need to be mindful that policy approach needs to be consistent with certainly the planning policy for traveller sites, but also as inspectors obviously have an eye on the public sector equality duty and ensuring there's no sort of unfair distinction between people who've got protected characteristics. In terms of some of the other criterion in the policy, I appreciate they were found sound as part of the last local plan, but in terms of, I want to just look at particularly criterion probably B, D and F, just very briefly. Policy B talks about compatibility with surrounding area, particularly when located within residential areas. I think the council's probably seen the same representations I've seen as well. This is a potential sort of hostage to fortune criteria that people could object to any Gypsy traveller proposal and sort of say this is inherently incompatible with our locality or the character of this area, and therefore should be be refused. What's the council seeking to achieve through this particular criterion, and could it be used or applied potentially overzealously to kind of inhibit otherwise acceptable proposals coming forward?
I think it would be the opposite. It does align with the character policies in the particularly the built-up area boundary, outside the built-up area boundary policy, and also DD1, which is the general design policy. I think actually what it would do is simply require the design to take account of any amenity impacts and ensure that they are resolved as part of the planning application, rather than just staying silent on the matter, really. So it's making sure that is you know, an appropriate design. It reflects national planning policy guidance, both in relation to traveller sites and general development. And paragraph 26B of the planning policy for traveller sites requires sites to be well planned or soft landscape in a way to positively enhance the environment and increase its openness. From a Crawley point of view, obviously we are an urban area and wouldn't discount traveller sites coming forward within the urban area, so it doesn't necessarily have to reflect an openness, but it should reflect the character of the area as any development would.
Thank you for that. And then in terms of criterion D about sustainable location, I think the submissions, or one of the submissions we've had, is Crawley's geographically a relatively compact borough. It could be arguable that everywhere in Crawley could be sustainably located. So does that criterion have effect, really?
Yes. We feel that Crawley was designed on a neighbourhood basis. We have neighbourhood centres for each of the neighbourhoods which offer amenity facilities. We feel that traveller sites should equally be located to get as much advantage of those as possible. And again, that reflects national guidance as well.
On criterion F, in terms of meeting an identified local need, I think the council's referred to already that in terms of recent experiences actually come from outside of the borough. And again, whether criterion F could be used to perhaps inappropriately resist kind of external kind of proposals from those who are not sort of from a local Gypsy or traveller or travelling show person household.
Yeah, as we set out in our response to your MIQ to Matter 6, the borough is very constrained, and it wouldn't be appropriate for Crawley to be taking a substantial proportion of unmet needs, particularly from outside of the borough. What we have experienced is travellers moving into the borough onto private sites, where they have genuine need for connection for facilities within Crawley, such as schools or hospital or employment. Obviously that equally is appropriate. That's local connections. So from that perspective, we still feel that an identified local need as a criteria is an appropriate one.
Okay, thank you for that. Just before you take the mid-morning adjournment, obviously there are various proposed modifications in Schedule 7E. I think just to kind of give a heads up to the council, I mean, a number of them are what I think the council's described, I think we would agree, as sort of factual updates that reflect the latest GTAA. There's quite a number there. I think initial view is that they are probably best presented as proposed main modifications, whether they're kind of put together as one single main modification rather than sort of separating that out into kind of component paragraphs in terms of the context. That then leads us to policy H8. I think we will further reflect on just making sure that that wording will be effective for what I think the council is seeking to achieve, but certainly as it's currently presented, that amended wording to policy H8 would be a further main modification that we would be seeking to recommend for soundness. And then similarly, there's some further changes to the supporting text for policy H8. There's probably a blend in there of things that not necessary for soundness, and perhaps some that are and again, it may just be more straightforward to kind of wrap all those up together again as just one further main modification, and then everybody would get an opportunity to comment on those. I've got no further questions on policy H8. If there's anything further from the council on this matter, no.
No, just
Okay.
to say thank you.
Thank you for that, and thank you for Mr. Monk for your contributions on the noise, helping us understand the noise issue. It's now 11:30, probably a bit later than planned, but we'll take a mid-morning adjournment now for 15 minutes, 15 minutes, and we'll resume here at 11:45 to continue the discussion on Matter 6 and housing policies. Thank you. Okay, it's 11:45. We've just gone 11:45, so I'm going to resume the hearing sessions. We're now moving on in terms of the agenda. We're coming back to, done things slightly out of sequence, but we're going to come back to issues more around the general approach, particularly to key housing sites that are within the plan, and whether the approach to their identification and the capacity that the council is anticipating will come forward from these sites is robust in terms of how the housing trajectory will fit together. And I think for this session, is it Mr. Warren who's going to be assisting from the Borough Council?
Mainly, yes.
Okay, and you're joined by, is it your colleague Mr. Dillon?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Good. And I think in terms of starting this discussion, I think it comes back to our MIQ 6.1 and looking at the sites that are within policy H2. We appreciate there's a kind of a blend of sites based on the MPPF kind of terminology about those that are going to be deliverable, developable, and then sort of further broad locations, whether those, the capacity that's identified for those sites, particularly those that have got current or had planning permission, whether that capacity remains correct or justified as of the 1st of April 2023. Looking at the council statement, I think there's been some changes. Perhaps I can invite the council first to kind of just take us through those sites, whether there are any changes that the examination needs to be aware of, either sites that have got to come out or capacities adjusted. So is it Mr. Warren first?
Hopefully that's better. Yes, so in overall terms, the approach in relation to the H2 sites is that where there are planning proposals that have got to the stage of at least having a resolution to grant planning permission or other sort of status beyond that, we've tried to reflect that capacity in the policy for the most part. Where that's not the case, where the proposals haven't yet got to that stage, we've broadly been informed by the approach set out elsewhere in the design policies of considering them against the proposed minimum densities and the site-specific issues with those sites. There's a few kind of nuances to that in terms of specific sites. So, for example, Forgewood Phase B, the proposed capacity there is we've got 434, which is lower than the residual figure within the outline application for 1900 dwellings, this being the last phase. But the lower figure in the policy reflects the status of consideration of the reserved matters proposals, which are currently still pending determination. But as I understand it, the proposal now is for that phase to be at that quantity of development. We're proposing to take out Zurich House, one site that's been completed. In respect of other sites, yes, they broadly go along the approach I've sort of described in terms of either reflecting the having got a resolution to grant planning permission or some stronger planning status, or else a kind of assessment of site constraints against minimum densities. Happy to sort of focus in on any that you have particular queries about, and also in terms of the timing of delivery of those sites. There have been some changes since the submission version was prepared, delays for various reasons, particularly a number of kind of shorter delays associated with water neutrality.
And in terms of sort of the general approach to kind of site capacity and profiling when sites are likely to deliver as part of the SLAR process and ongoing monitoring, do you sort of annually engage with site promoters, site developers to kind of check and calibrate any assumptions that you've thought about for these sites as to whether that is when it's going to come forward, or that density is reasonable, and has there been that sort of sense checking with the development industry?
I guess over the process of the preparation of this local plan, we've done a couple of rounds of sending communications out to site promoters and agents or owners to understand what their plans are and what period of time they see their sites as being delivered. We don't undertake that as standard as part of the kind of annual monitoring that we do. I suppose one general observation that I would make about Crawley is where I think I may have said something similar in the stage 1 hearings, but where we're dealing with a large number of kind of smaller to medium-sized sites on brownfield land, there isn't quite the same kind of dynamic as you might find in a rural district, where sites are being kind of consistently promoted over a kind of period of years through a local plan process, and then subsequently. I mean, we do have that with some sites, but very often sites have a sort of shorter lead-in time, and the response that, I mean, it's been reflected in the rate of, I suppose, the rate of response that we've had with some of these communication exercises which we've undertaken with developers, where there hasn't been as much response for all of the sites as we might ideally have liked. And so I think there's a tendency perhaps for, particularly in relation to brownfield sites, for owners and promoters to kind of hedge their bets sometimes in terms of engaging, sort of setting out timescales, and rather they sort of come to a stage where they kind of identify that the time is opportune and engage directly with the development management process. I guess in many cases we're dealing with sites as well that could potentially come forward without an allocation as well, given the sort of size and location. So the kind of engagement between the council and I guess a kind of corollary of the circumstances in Crawley is that there isn't the kind of discussions around 5-year housing land supply haven't been as kind of intense as in some authorities, and I guess there's a sense that the sites, for the most part, the sites that are suitable are ones we're kind of promoting, that we're supporting. Both from the perspective of the council and the perspective of site promoters, the kind of engagement over site of build out and housing and sort of trajectory timelines hasn't been as intense or perhaps as useful maybe to both parties as maybe in some other districts.
Thank you. No, that's helpful, Mr. Warren, in terms of just understanding that context. I think you kind of invited me if there was any particular sites to kind of look at or we want to sort of drill into. I see the council has helpfully set out, in response to our MIQ 6.2, a kind of a table of the kind of various key sites within policy H2. We'll come on to some of the specific allocations with Mr. Rollings shortly, but in terms of just other sites within that table that we kind of just have a quick look at. You mentioned the Forgewood phase 4B, and that's helpful kind of understanding of how that the numbers will work on that particular site. In terms of other, I'll just sort of describe them as larger sites that perhaps don't get a specific mention or specific kind of policy content within H2. We've got the land adjacent to Desmond Anderson in Tilgate and land southeast of Heathy Farm as part of the Forgewood location. Are those I mean, presumably they're not complex sites in terms of they haven't warranted sort of further specific kind of policy content within the plan as we've got for Tinsley Lane or other sites, but in terms of their assessment as kind of developable sites to come forward within the plan period, I don't know if Mr. Warren, you can just sort of briefly outline kind of the robustness of how they've been identified and the kind of the capacities you're identifying for them.
Yes, so land adjacent to Desmond Anderson, that's you may be aware that's an allocation in the existing plan that we're proposing to carry forward. It's actually owned by West Sussex County Council, who are promoting it. We've got it as a developable site on the basis that we don't have the enough evidence to kind of expect it sooner. In terms of the kind of complexity of the site, it does have ancient woodland to the south, and there are and parts of it are affected by flood risk. Those are the sort of the main issues with it. But otherwise, it's in a sustainable location. A key factor in that sort of informs our sort of thinking about site capacity is particularly access to public transport connections, and that's something that has informed us particularly in suggesting what we sort of characterise as a sort of medium density for that site. In relation to the land southeast of Heathy Farm. That site was in the previous plan. It was identified as a broad location. I think, I mean, the history of it goes back slightly beyond my time at the council, but I think it was both this site and the site land at Steers Lane, which is currently in the process of being built out. Both of those sites were, over a number of years, we've been aware of those as kind of residual sites that weren't included in the master plan for Forge Wood. I understand primarily for land ownership reasons, and so they, both of them have been kind of on the in part of the identified housing land supply for a period of time. The Steers Lane site, as I mentioned, is being built out. This site, it has been promoted as over the course of our sort of consultations on this plan, and we're proposing to allocate it. We would see this as a developable rather than a deliverable site. As with land adjacent to Desmond Anderson, it is sort of partly adjacent to an area of ancient woodland. And again, our consideration of site capacity is really partly informed by the it's the approach set out elsewhere in the in terms of the design policies. So the minimum densities being a reference point, but also consideration of as to how those are kind of affected by site-specific constraints. In the case of this site, we did look at this from the perspective of ancient woodland, but we did still consider that that it would be capable of supporting this number of dwellings. That this might require some adaptations in terms of the design on account of the site-specific constraints, but bearing in mind, our issues with housing supply and unmet need, and the intention to make as effective use of land as possible, we thought that the figure was justified on that basis.
Thank you. And in terms of the Desmond Anderson site, that I think has been part of the background paper following the strategic flood risk assessment. So you've kind of looked again just to make sure that that still can yield that identified capacity.
Yes, we don't see that update as having enough. There's sort of small changes pretty small changes in terms of the portions of the site that are in different zones, but we don't see it as affecting the potential capacity. Sorry, I think Mr. Dillon would like to add something.
Yes, sorry, just to add just a little bit of detail on that. You need a certain amount of open space with the scheme. So the flooding area can be used as one of the feature areas for outdoor space, for example. And even though it's slightly increased, that still didn't make much of a difference. And just what Ian was referring to in regard to the Heathy Farm site, is the typology that can change. So you may not be able to achieve that amount of semi-detached houses, but you can still achieve the minimum densities by using apartment typologies or masonette typologies. So we can still achieve efficient use of land, but being aware of the need for a different approach to unit type.
Thank you. A number of the sites that are identified in the Council's Matter 6 statement under H2, I'm sort of mindful we will come back to look at those as part of town centre site, opportunity site discussions tomorrow, so I'm not going to sort of dig too deeply on those now. Before I move on to particularly to MIQ 6.3, I don't know if I wanted to at this point afford an opportunity. I don't know if there's anything further from Mr. Hendy on behalf of Persimmon Homes. Obviously your site interest. Am I correct in that this is the Forgewood location that we've...
So it's Phase 4B.
Phase 4B. And
yes.
you've heard the council in terms of their submissions, in terms of the capacity that they're identifying.
Yes,
for policy.
I can sort of elaborate on that. So I did contact Mr. Warren in the past few months just to update on the housing trajectory. So it was showing 100 completions per annum. We think we'll only get 60. To get any completions this year, we'd need to be on site by March, which we don't think is going to happen now because of the timescale on the determination of the Reserve Matters application. So we have had that dialogue on delivery and completions. The original Reserve Matters application was for 493, and it was amended in July 2021 to 434. Obviously, that's still, we're still in discussions with the council to come up with a scheme that everyone's happy with before that can be put to committee. So that figure 434 is what we're working to at the minute. I think it's fair to say, if Mr. Dillon agrees with me, that the numbers are to some extent affected by urban design. So the reduction in from 493 to 434 was to address some of the urban design comments that were made soon after the application was submitted.
Thank you. And just to kind of help my understanding of the kind of the Forgewood development, is that the kind of the final piece of the Forgewood, the current sort of, or the existing Forgewood jigsaw, if I can put it in those terms?
It is. It's the last phase, which is the Persimmon phase. Taylor Wimpey have built out all of their plots.
Can I just check with Mr. Warren or Mr. Dillon in terms of what I've heard from Mr. Hendy in terms of perhaps a slight reduction in how that site could yield? Has that been reflected in the latest December 2023 housing trajectory that's been provided to the examination?
Yes, it does reflect comments that Mr. Hendy, correspondence we had with Mr. Hendy in the last few months, as he says. I'm not sure to what extent he's sort of suggesting that further to that, the situation with the Reserve Matters has kind of affected that further. I think, because I think we have in the trajectory 10 completions for 24 to 25. Yes, so it may be that Mr. Hendy now thinks that they won't achieve the 10 completions in 2024 to 5, but I guess the 60 dwellings per annum in the years thereafter would, that would be in line with his comment, as I understand.
Thank you. I see Mr. Pete wants to come in on this point.
Yes, thank you. So I represent Homes England in relation to the Tinsley Lane site, and whilst it's not been touched on specifically, it seems that it might be appropriate just to come in on capacity and trajectory on that site now. I appreciate we're going to be talking in a bit more detail about the site this afternoon, but so obviously we're here to support the council in their reallocation of the site. It was originally allocated back in 2015. We're comfortable with the indicative capacity on site of 120, but it's probably worth just explaining a little bit of context and progress that's been made since the 2015 allocation. So we've documented it in our hearing statement, but since 2015 there has been the devising of the development brief, the SPD, that was put into place in 2017. There's been an application in 2018 for up to 150 homes on that site that was refused against officers' recommendation on density and amenity grounds. Since that time, we've come back in, and we currently have a pending application in that was submitted in 2021 for up to 138 homes. We had an informal recommendation for approval, but unfortunately water neutrality got in the way. We will be picking that application back up very shortly, so I think in terms of progress there's been a lot of thought and effort that's gone into moving that application forward, or that allocation forward, and ultimately what we think can be deliverable on that site. I know the previous inspector's comments that noted that 138 or up to 138 dwellings could be provided on that site, assuming that the sports provision is delivered to the north, on the northern parcel. I think it's worth saying that, you know, through the work that we've done on both applications, we believe that we've confirmed that the housing provision, the sports provision, can happen to the north, and therefore we believe 138 might be a more appropriate capacity figure for this allocation. I think that's the first point. You know, just on the basis of density, it's clear that the 128.20 indicative quantum for the site is significantly below the 45 minimum set out in policy CL4. The 138 application that we have in front of us at the moment is only at a density of 32. So we have been through several application processes to get to this point, and we now feel that we've got a solution that works. So as I say, whilst we can live with 120 indicative quantum, we think it could deliver more, and hopefully we've proved that in recent application processes. Just regarding trajectory, we have been in contact with Mr. Warren and confirmed that we believe, and Homes England are expecting the site to deliver fully across the first 5 years of the plan. And we're comfortable and firmly believe that will come forward in that way.
Thank you for that. As you've identified, Mr. Peake, we will come on shortly to that side, but that's helpful introduction, and we'll we will come back to that shortly. In terms of where this may all lead in terms of the overall trajectory, I'm going to reserve that for this afternoon, and we'll come back to sort of how the council's going to propose to kind of step the trajectory and some of the proposed amendments that are now presented in Schedule 7E in terms of the particular numbers, in terms of the soundness of that. I would just like to pick up our MIQ 6.3, and in terms of, I think it's already been referred to by the council on a number of sites, particularly this issue around the presence of ancient woodland, either within sites or very close to sites, and just in terms of whether sort of the general approach that the council's taken when looking at the capacity of sites in H2 has appropriately looked at buffered from, where necessary, ancient woodland, and whether policy GI2 provides the kind of the effective backstop in any event when looking at individual detailed proposals as and when they come forward. So invite Mr. Warren in the first instance in terms of the council's approach, please.
Thank you. Yes, so we would maintain that the policy GI2 provides sufficient protection for ancient woodland in the context of specific development proposals. In terms of site allocations, as we set out in our response on this question, there are the 4 sites that are in policy H2 that have a close relationship, or they're sort of adjacent to ancient woodland. So this is Forgewood Phase 4B, land adjacent to Desmond Anderson, land southeast of Heathy Farm and Tinsley Lane. So both in respect of Tinsley Lane and Forgewood Phase 4B, those are relatively well advanced in different ways as planning proposals, and work has been done as part of that to take fully informed account of the ancient woodland constraints. In relation to the other 2 sites, we appreciate that further technical work would be required in support of any proposal to identify the exact extent to which the area of the site is affected, and to include an appropriate buffer zone. But as part of our assessment of the site for purposes of plan allocation, we do recognise the need to include appropriate buffer zones around the ancient woodland as part of that, and that's factored into the capacity that we've identified.
Obviously, we have representations before us from Woodland Trust. I know Sussex Wildlife Trust as well made representations on this matter and responded to our question. I don't know if Ms. Brooke, there's anything further from SWT's perspective you wish to bring to our attention today?
Yeah, obviously I'm a conservation officer and not a planning officer, so my submission made reference to the H2 policy and the information that came forward. Obviously we can see from our mapping the areas where there are potential for conflicts with ancient woodland, and we were supportive of the approach that was taken for a development brief for Tinsley Lane to recognise the potential impacts. What I would say is I feel the information currently within the plan makes it slightly inaccessible for us to understand cumulative and individual impacts. And what I sort of really mean by that is the information in policy H2 doesn't really outline the exact allocation. So we have the information there, but it's usually our experience we'll have the opportunity to look at an individual allocation with an outlined map, and then that allows us to give more detailed comments about potential things that could be in a policy that may be specific and pertinent to that area. So in some ways we found that slightly inaccessible. But I would say the information that's in GI2 represents the information that is in the MPPF. It recognises against loss and deterioration. So I would hope that would come forward with each individual application. I guess I might just query, obviously, the recognition that there are other sites that could potentially be impacted by ancient woodland. I know the minimum buffer is 15 metres. The Woodland Trust make it really clear in their planner's manual they'd have a preference for 50 metres, which I know would probably bring some discussion forward from others. But the point I would like to make is that I'm pleased that that policy standing is there in GI2, and I would hope any applications come forward would recognise that loss or deterioration wouldn't be acceptable, because we don't really think any of the sites that have come forward represent wholly exceptional circumstances.
Thank you. In terms of my understanding of the 15 metres, that's a Natural England standing advice, and that presumably is the starting point for the Borough Council in terms of looking at capacity for some of the H2 sites.
Yes, yes, we would certainly, that's certainly something that the 15 metres minimum buffer zone is something that we accept should inform our assessment of site capacity, and it has. We appreciate that that's not the specific extent or nature of the constraints, may be more refined than that, once as part of the detailed assessment.
Thank you. Is there anything further people wish to say in relation to our MIQs 6.1 through to 6.3? As I say to the council, we will come back, I think, this afternoon and just look again at the trajectory as a whole. So I'm going to reserve questions about that till this afternoon. Ms. Brooke, again, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one further point. Obviously, I mentioned the development brief for Tinsley Lane. I'm not sure if I can ask this question or who I'm meant to ask it to. Is the council looking to bring forward other development briefs for sites that might be impacted by ancient woodland?
Thank you. I mean, it's probably a question to the council whether it goes to sort of plan soundness, whether the policy H2 should refer or potentially refer to other development briefs. My recollection is there are a number of development briefs for various sites in varying degrees of adoptedness or otherwise. Is there any intention to do further development briefs?
For the open space sites, the housing and open space sites, we committed to doing development briefs. 2 of those we have published and adopted. One of them, which is the land East Balcombe Road, Street Hill, which we'll be discussing shortly, it's been out to consultation twice. It's still in a draft form. It wasn't progressed because of the capacity of the team and the clash with the local plan review. So that's where that's sat. In terms of the other sites, the land adjacent Desmond Anderson, there's not an intention specifically in the policy in the plan, nor for the land south east of Heathy Farm to bring forward development briefs, but the council is obviously mindful of the progression towards character area statements and looking more of those. So it may well be that's something that gets wrapped up as part of that in the future. But at this moment in time, it's only the 3 that were previously committed that the council have identified as bringing forward.
Thank you for that. At this point, then, I think I'm going to hand over to Mr. Rollings, who'll take us through some of the specific sites within policy H2. Thank you.
Thanks. Dovetailing with the previous question, just wondering where the supplementary planning brief for land east of Balcombe Road is at the moment, please.
Yeah, so it was published for consultation in November 2018 last. So it is a draft. It's still available, but it hasn't progressed to an adoption. There were a number of comments that had been received as part of that consultation that the council just simply didn't have the capacity to consider at that stage. But we do feel that it is it had previously been out to a consultation, and the representations that were received to that consultation are also published on the council's website alongside the document, and the council does believe that it is a detailed reflection of the overall policy implications of that site. So it's not an adopted document, but it is still a technical sort of supporting evidence. It doesn't introduce new policy. It's all based on the adopted local plan.
Does the council have an appetite for adoption of it at the moment?
At this point in time, the focus is very much on the local plan adoption and then, review. It is in the local development scheme as a document that the council intends to bring forward and adopt.
Mr. Fullwood, what's your view on the brief?
So we certainly commented on behalf of the landowner, and there have been two stages of the brief. The first appeared extremely restrictive and proposed, I think from memory, an illustrative scheme of 4 dwellings. And in fact, on behalf of the owner, we submitted a legal challenge to that brief on the basis that the inspector certainly must have had in mind that there was capacity to achieve 15 dwellings on this site, or closer, certainly much closer to 15 than the illustrated 4. And that actually the draft brief was seeking to supplant, or if you like, become a superior document to the adopted plan, by constraining it so much further that it would not be lawful. And so that was the initial brief. The second brief we also made a lot of comments on. I think we feel that the policy as set out has very good guidance and reflects very well, indeed was written by the last inspector at the last inquiry. And it would provide an extremely useful basis on which, well, in fact a sufficient basis on which to submit a planning application. And just to update, as we're on housing trajectory, again, I've been in discussion with Mr. Warren about this to support the dialogue that does occur. And we're at the stage now of preparing the planning application, and it will be in discussion with the Borough Council, obviously. As I understand it, it's possible that from the Borough Council's position that they would be happy to receive a planning application at this stage in the context of the submitted policy. And so, because of the nature of the site, there are obviously a need for a lot of survey work, additional survey work to be undertaken. And the finances are now in place for that, and that work is about to be commissioned with a view to a planning application later this year for this site, and with a view to bringing the site forward as soon as the planning application is approved, and given the number of dwellings on the site, it's likely that the site can be completed as one relatively quickly. Thank you.
So within 5 years?
Oh, certainly. It's certainly a developable site.
Thank you. Just out of interest, is there any difference between a development brief and a planning brief in terms of how the council treats sites, or is it just a matter of semantics?
Yeah, it just depends on what they're called. They are all published as supplementary planning documents, so they are all dealt with through formal consultation and adopted accordingly.
Great, thanks. I'd just like to ask a couple of questions about the status of the local wildlife site. Is it under any sort of management at the moment? Are your landowners responsible for it at the moment, Mr. Fullwood?
They own the site, and just to confirm, it is under no management at all. that's not an obligation following designation that management naturally follows, and indeed it is not happening. And indeed no management has occurred since the site was designated 30 years ago.
Would there be management as part of a Section 106, for example? Would it be viable on such a small site to have a management plan in place?
Certainly, that is the intention here, because we certainly recognise that in the avoid, mitigate or compensate sequence that's in the NPPF, most of the local wildlife site, as it's now called, is avoided. For the allocated part of the site, the illustrative housing site, is on the least ecologically rich area of the site. In fact, it's where it's called the Worth Meadows local wildlife site, and the meadows are fast disappearing on this part of the site where the housing allocation is located. And since the last local plan inquiry, they've disappeared further, encroached by bramble at the edges. So there are only very, very small pockets now remaining of this principal habitat for which the site was originally designated. However, there are areas to the north of the site where it does remain, and it can be retained as part of a positive long-term management plan. It seems to me that's the only way that the management teeth for this site can come into play through an enabling development of this type, which is sensitive to the site but allows its long-term management.
As part of the application, will you be updating the Phase 1 management, Phase 1 habitat survey?
Absolutely, that's one of the first commissions that will be undertaken. Update the Phase 1, and then for any species identified within Phase 1 as requiring Phase 2, or subsequent study, that will be undertaken too.
Now, in terms of bramble incursion and the degradation of the site, and Ms. Brooke, perhaps you can help. How does that occur? Is that brought in by access, for example, or is it just a natural process?
I mean, from my observation, I'm not an ecologist, but from my observation, and for anybody's observation of walking the countryside, really, I mean, bramble will just move on and grow fairly robustly and rapidly, yes, it's overtaking the remainder of the meadow. Sorry, I'm sure.
Yeah, just a couple of points to make on the site. Obviously, the site, as was pointed out, was originally designated in 1992, and I see from submissions made to the matter that the information relating to the Phase 1 habitat survey was from 2013, so that's 10 years plus ago that survey information was made. So therefore, I have slight concerns about saying housing will be allocated on the least environmentally sensitive aspect of the local wildlife site when the survey information is so outdated it wouldn't sit with guidelines in terms of determining decisions at the moment. In terms of the scrub encroachment that's happened on the site, obviously that is a process of succession within habitat where you move through if it's not managed in particular ways. Obviously, when the citation and designation of the site happened in 1992, recommendations were provided on how the site could be managed to enhance and maintain that meadow process. I would say it's the position of the Sussex wildlife site that just because a local wildlife site has become degraded over time, it shouldn't make it open and ripe for development. And I'd also say that an enabling development is not the only mechanism that would be in place to improve management of the local wildlife site. Obviously, we're entering a phase of, through the Environment Act 2021, where biodiversity net gain will come into play. Local wildlife sites, unlike other designated sites such as SSSIs or internationally designated sites, will be able to receive or deliver biodiversity net gain. So that would mean there would potentially be funding available to allow positive management of that site. So I would step back from the point in case that it would be impossible to improve the management without enabling development. Also in my matter statement, I highlighted that also through the Environment Act, we're moving to a stage where we have responsible authorities. Here in West Sussex, it's West Sussex County Council, and Crawley will be a supporting authority of the local nature recovery strategy. The guidelines that came out for local nature recovery strategies made very clear through certain elements which I've highlighted in my case study of where the paragraphs are, that local wildlife sites will be key to those nature recovery strategies. And these are really areas that we see as providing the climate resilience and network opportunities for our natural environment.
Mr. Fullwood, I'll just, a couple of Ms. Brooks' points I'll put to the Council first. Was there any reconsideration of the status of the local wildlife site as part of this local plan process?
We did look at all of the sites again. We felt that we had objected to the site as part of the previous planning as part of the previous local plan process, and we felt that the inspector's decision whereby the retention of some of the site and the management and improvement was balanced. I have to obviously concur with the Wildlife Trust's advice as well. In relation to that, I think that the council just felt that that it wasn't on a particularly confident footing to remove the site as an allocation on the basis of the previous planning inspector's decisions. So from that perspective, that's where we stood. However, we obviously still have reservations and concerns that the site would need extremely careful design, layout, which is why we spent so long trying to get the development brief correct. Obviously, as part of doing the development brief, there were a number of more detailed things that you would find would crop up as you look at a site like that in more detail. I think that it is significantly of concern that a site is allowed to degrade to such an extent that then it's acceptable for housing to be built on. I think that is definitely a sad situation that we are in. But I could see that actually if there was careful design and careful management, there is the potential for the site to come forward positively. I think that's where obviously we would need a lot more information through a planning application, and that's where we were getting to with the development brief.
Great, thank you. Mr. Fullwood.
I think in terms of the status of the survey, at the moment, this is an indicative housing site within a broader allocation, and so there is an opportunity to sort of flex around subject to a further survey, which is certainly what we're promising. In terms of biodiversity net gain, certainly we're aware and supportive of the Environment Act and its requirements, and would wish the site to perform a role as that, but it would need the landowner's consent to move on to the site and to be able to use it positively for that. It's obviously not in my gift, and it's their decision whether to bring that forward or not. And it is their intention to bring it forward for this purpose with some enabling development, and that's the the balance that the Borough Council talks about. The enabling development is essential, really, to improving the wildlife in this area and making best use of the site from that point of view, from the balanced point of view.
Thank you. And Ms. Brooke, is bramble rehabilitation and wildlife rehabilitation as well, in terms of that being a long-term process, that's something that presumably has been done elsewhere and proven elsewhere. What sort of time frame are we looking at?
I mean, that is quite an open-ending question. In terms of the level and degree of management that you would go on, I would say, obviously, taking a site as it is right now, obviously it was designated for a certain habitat, but given the length of time and the potential degradation from that initial survey and its designation for that, it could be a considerable amount of time. It would depend on the level of, I think, obviously, clearing or grazing is potentially an aspect of that site, but also you have to consider, before you change anything, what has moved into that site within that 30-year period. Obviously, that scrub and additional woodland gives rise to potential bird species and a whole variety of things. So before you'd make any change, you would have to undertake the survey anyway. One point I would like to make is that I feel the planning practice guidance is very clear about local wildlife sites being protected from harm or loss, and we're quite clear that we see in the local plan under section 12.57 that there's a suggestion that at least a third of the local wildlife site will be lost, and it would be our position that therefore it shouldn't go forward as an allocation.
Mr. Fullwood.
Well, I mean, it's quite clear from national guidance and from the NPPG and NPPF that, and indeed policy GI2 in this plan, and indeed the representations brought forward by Sussex Wildlife Trust themselves in relation to this policy, and you know they asked for the wording in this policy to talk about avoiding, but where it cannot be avoided, then I'm trying to find the exact words, where impacts cannot be avoided and adequate mitigation and compensation measures will be provided to offset any harm caused by the site's important assets. Well, that's the balance we're talking about in this, and it seems to be accepted. Seems to me to be acceptable within the wording of the NPPF, NPPG, and indeed Sussex Wildlife Trust's own submission in relation to this policy.
Great, thanks. I think any other questions I ask will probably get too far into the nitty-gritty of a development application, so I won't ask any more. Mr. Spencer, do you have any questions?
Not on this particular side. I think it's become clear from the sort of various contributions. I think people's respective positions. It seems to me that Sussex Wildlife Trust would be putting to us the proposed main modification to delete this housing allocation. Obviously, Mr. Forward is recommending its continued insertion in the plan. I've got no further questions on that.
Okay. I'm just going to check the timetable, because unless there's anyone new for random sites after the break, perhaps I could shunt a couple of those questions up to now.
Yeah, we're potentially sitting till 1 o'clock, so yep.
Okay, sorry, just do a bit of rejigging here. Questions on Desmond Anderson and Heathy Farmer. Okay, just one other question, really. In terms of the Horsham plan and the Reg 19 and where that is, has that got any impact on Kilnwood Vale or land west of Ifield generally in terms of delivery from Crawley? Does it affect anything coming forward I'll get on to issues with the area of search for the Western Transport link on Thursday. But in terms of housing delivery, is there anything there that we need to be aware of?
So if the question is, do those proposals have implications for sites and capacities in this plan? We don't think so, no.
Okay, thanks. Are there any issues with any outline consents falling out of time due to water neutrality issues at all, or is that something that's that you're expecting to be resolved?
So the deadlines that are associated with outline consents are typically, I think, for reserved matters to be submitted within a particular period of time. So I think with the outline consents that we have, those reserved matters have been submitted. So there isn't that risk in respect of water neutrality. We did have one site sort of right at the end of the housing trajectory, the Gables care home, where they had a detailed planning permission to demolish a kind of existing sort of derelict building that was formerly a nursing home, and to rebuild a new facility. And they were unfortunately caught by the CG Fry Commission at the state of discharging conditions prior to commencement. So they weren't able to commence and went out of time on that basis. And therefore, that's one change now in this housing trajectory as compared to the previous one, that site has gone from being deliverable to developable. But that's the only case of that nature.
And does the council remain reasonably confident that everything that has permission in your statement is likely to be built out or be developed under those existing permissions?
Broadly speaking, yes. There are. Yes, we're talking about the H2. The H2 sites, yes, I would say so. Sorry, one slightly sort of slight refinement of that is that the 44 Goffs Park Road site. I think in some of our some references to it refer to it as Oakhurst Grange, which is another sort of older person specialist site where there's a permission that has been commenced as a result of the demolition of the existing building, but there's rather than implementing that permission, they've submitted a new one, so it's more likely that the new permission will be implemented, but it's sort of a broadly comparable scale, and we do still think that the site is deliverable on that basis.
Thank you. And has there been any interest in developing St Catherine's Hospice? Any partners that you're aware of?
Yes, so that site, among those sites that we've identified as deliverable, that one is certainly less advanced in terms of formal planning proposals, but there's been more significant work going on sort of behind the scenes in relation to that. The council is involved in that site with a landed interest and has been engaged in. So it's been just very recently the facility has been relocated to the development site in Pease Pottage, just over the borough boundary. So that the new hospice there is now open, and they started transferring patients, I understand, in December, So that site is sort of released, and the hospice has an interest now in releasing that land, and they've been involved in discussions with the council and other parties about different schemes for the development of that site. So we given that kind of background work, we and bearing in mind the scale and the location of the site, we do that's the basis on which we consider it to be deliverable. I don't know if Miss LePage might want to add anything. She's been more closely involved in those discussions, or maybe I've covered the key points.
Yeah, I think Ian's picked up the key points, but just to say the council's been actively involved in a collaboration agreement with the hospice, with the other sort of landowners on the site, and we are a major landowner, so obviously it's in our interest to bring the site forward corporately, as well as to support the hospice who need the funding on the sort of charity basis to help. So.
Great, thank you. That's all I have. As Mr. Spencer said, there's a few town centre sites, but we'll pick them up in the morning. Oh, yep. Can do. I did have a question about that, actually. Right. Breezehurst Drive. Whereabouts is that at the moment, please?
So at the moment, it's quite well advanced. It benefits from a resolution to grant planning permission, detailed planning permission, and it has a water neutrality proposal which has been accepted by Natural England. So this is a CBC council-owned site which was allocated in the previous plan. Again, similar to Tinsley Lane, a development brief was adopted, and it's the proposal that currently is at the moment what's in the process of the legal agreements being concluded is for 85 dwellings that would be 100% affordable. So. And I guess it's worth mentioning as well that that's one of the two kind of pilot schemes for the water neutrality offsetting scheme. The other one being the Longley House scheme.
And is there any issues with the delivery of the sports facilities? Or is there anything that's going to be knotty in the future?
We don't think so. So it does involve the loss of an area of space that is it's been disused for a number of years, and it's counted in our playing pitch evidence as a kind of lapsed site, but essentially the proposal that we've got has Sport England have accepted that the provision of a new playing pitch as part of the within the site, combined with the proposals to require improvements to drainage on other sites in the locality would satisfy the sort of Sport England exception tests for allowing the loss of part of that open space.
Great, okay, we'll go to lunch. Back at 2 with Tinsley Lane, recreation and other housing discussion. Thank you.